Here's $5.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah.
What is this for?
It's you won the bet.
What was the bet?
The over-under on Fugate. Man.
Oh, that's right.
I really thought he was going to swear more. I thought he was going to be dropping F-bombs like left and right.
Yeah, so Mitch and I had a bet on how many curse words Craig Fugate would use on our podcast.
Yeah.
I think it was one.
It was one.
But it was a doozy.
It was one, and then I had to throw it back at him because I was trying to look cool.
Yeah, you're trying to be cool.
Yeah. It didn't work.
Well, thanks for the cash.
Yeah, you're welcome, man. Buy me a coffee or something, or some beer with it.
We'll see.
We were broadcasting tonight, obviously from an undisclosed location. We're deep underground.
That's right.
Because of our subject matter. But I wanted to tell you, and here's my story for tonight, okay? Which is, I grew up in South Georgia.
Yeah. Oh, gosh. How long is this story going to be?
Well, I was born on the banks of a river.
On the shores of South Georgia.
And I lived near this town called Thomasville, Georgia, and I was always fascinated by it because I always heard the stories of this scary bunker that was in Thomasville. And a couple of years ago, I went there. I drove up to it. There was a guard gate in front of this shack in the middle, not even listed on a map in Thomasville. I drove up there, and I like an idiot. I walked up and I was like, "So, how you doing, guys? What's going on back there?" And they got me out of there in a hurry. And it turns out, because in this book that we're going to talk about tonight, it was in there. This secret bunker was there.
Wow. So lesson learned, don't go to bunkers in Georgia off the beaten path.
You're going to get a squirrel shot in your bottoms. What? I don't even know what that means.
Some people might like that.
Squirrel shot references. All right.
All right, well, we have another great episode tonight, and let's just get right into it. I'm going to read the bio, and because we have so many things we want to talk about with the author, so let's just jump into it. So Garrett Graff is a magazine journalist and a historian who's spent over a dozen years covering politics, technology, national security. He's written publications on The Wired, one of my favorite, The New York Times. He served as editor of The Washingtonian and Politico magazine. He's written several books. Some of the other ones he's written, The Threat Matrix, the FBI War in the Age of Global Terror, and The First Campaign, Globalization, the Web, and the Race for the White House. But we are here to talk about another book that Mitch and I love, called Raven Rock.
That's right. And actually, the full title of it is one of the best titles we've seen so far this year. Raven Rock, the story of the U.S. government's secret plan to save itself while the rest of us die. Which is unfortunately a phenomenon those of us in emergency management know a little too much about. And I want to give a shout out to listener Jason Basharov for turning us onto this book in the first place, which is, and we'll let Garrett himself talk about it in a second, but it really is about the government's continuity of government planning, which more and more over time was less and less about saving the citizens and more about saving the government's apparatus. And I'll clue you in, somehow before the end of this, a kinky Japanese sex site seems to be involved.
Interesting.
So Garrett, welcome. Welcome
with
to the
show. Thanks so much for the enthusiastic pitch.
I want to start out just first with a really, really important question, which is, was the U.S. government inspired by the supervillains in the James Bond movies, or were the supervillains inspired by the U.S. government?
So it's actually a funny question because what I've talked a lot with in the course of this book and certainly in the couple of weeks since its publication with authors who have written thrillers and done things, sort of in the fiction realm in this area. And what's been so funny about it is coming to understand that the plans, certainly as they developed since the end of World War II in this, umbrella of plans known as continuity of government, are actually all wackier and crazier than any of the conspiracy theories or fiction or movies that have been written about this over the years. That these plans are just so strange, and the vehicles and the constellation of facilities and bunkers and hideaways and secret airplanes and secret ships and special ICBMs.
And I just want you to validate me. The bunker I was talking about in Thomasville, real place, right?
Yes. And it was one of still is today, as you're saying, one of 8 regional bunkers around the United States that would have served as basically the homes of the regional federal governments during the Cold War, or even today. Thomasville, Georgia, Maynard, Massachusetts, Denton, Texas, and then you have those are just a tiny part of more than 100 of these bunkers and relocation facilities built all over the United States, and touching basically every state in the union in some way or another.
And, guy, if you haven't read this, the scope of this is unreal. I mean, we are not talking one underground bunker. We are talking like a dozen mountains that have miles and miles of tunnels,
right, and
massive ships and airplanes.
And blast doors, and the things are built on springs. The toilets have,
$10,000 hammers are nothing compared to massive man-sized springs throughout the United States.
It really is amazing, and it seems, when there's so many interesting stories in this book, and I just want to read excerpts from a couple. One from September 1935, which is roughly 80 years ago, about FDR after he dedicated Hoover Dam. And, from the book, it says FDR had become hopelessly lost in the canyons around Hoover Dam en route back to the train station in Las Vegas from the dam's dedication. And he was basically out of contact for several hours. No one knew where he was. And, a couple pages later, you talk about the White House back in the day before World War II, or I guess as late as 1910s, where visitors could walk into the White House, passerbys could go in. If the president wasn't at his desk, they could sit down and sit in his office. It just seems like a completely different, amazing world where this continuity of government got set up.
Feel where the president's butt had warmed the chair before you. So what happened, Garrett? Where does this story you're telling come from?
So this is, and I didn't realize this at the beginning of researching this book, but this is really the story of a technological revolution. And what you have is the story of these continuity of government plans is really the story of how nuclear weapons transformed the American presidency. And how, as you said, as late as the 1930s, it didn't really matter where the president of the United States was in the course of a single day. And as late as January 1945, when Harry Truman started as vice president, the vice president didn't receive any Secret Service protection at all. He just wandered unmolested through the streets of Washington. And the idea and the arrival of these nuclear weapons began to compress time and space in such a way that we needed to transform the institution of the presidency and ensure that it both was in constant communication, that we always knew where the president was and that he was always reachable to speak to the U.S. military, but then also that the presidency itself was never vacant, which was another big change. I mean, we went literally decades through the first 140 years of American history with no vice president at various points, with the president incapacitated for weeks or months at a time. And it was only really with the arrival of the nuclear age that you began to see the focus on things like presidential succession that led to the 25th Amendment that laid out a system that began to transform the presidency from just the one person that we think that we elect on the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November to something that today encompasses several hundred people to ensure that the presidency itself is never vacant, to ensure that there is always someone who is available to launch nuclear weapons in the event of a catastrophic attack on the United States.
So this started really under Eisenhower, if that's right. And Eisenhower is really remembered for, I think, his concern about the military-industrial complex. But one of the things you really point out in the book is that he, although he was wary about it, he was uncertain, he still marched us into this government, this continuity. We're not actually afraid of acronyms on this show, so we're just going to call it COG, continuity of government. And it was this expansive set of secret powers. And that secrecy seems to have really impacted the whole culture of it. So what was I mean, at one level it's obvious why it was so secret, but why were these guys as obsessed with the secrecy of it as they were?
Well, so this is part of the way that these plans transformed and created, I think, in many ways, our modern world. Because this was the first time, the atomic age was the first time that we, as a government, began to keep mass secrets for an indefinite period of time. And so, up until then, you had a secret battle plan or a secret diplomatic mission. But there were not, technical secrets that we were trying to keep for years on end that were known by hundreds and eventually thousands and then tens of thousands of people. And so it was really this COG world, it was really this nuclear world that gave rise to the national security state, where we now have, more than 1 million people in the United States with top secret security clearances. Because this was the first time that we really needed a classification system, was to keep these secrets.
And that secrecy, it seems to me, one of the kind of practical questions for our practitioners I wanted to ask was, to me, the secrecy of the plans really seemed to negatively impact their operational capacity, right? You tell sort of several stories about that. So what? Yeah, tell me.
And this was a problem throughout all of these plans. It's a problem up till today, where these plans are considered so secret that people who are involved in them don't even necessarily know how they would work. And that, and certainly, there's a level of this that, does require some secrecy, some tactical secrecy around, precisely who would be evacuated where. What the specific communications capabilities of specific facilities or specific vehicles might be. But part of this is also, I think, that there is a much larger and more troubling question wrapped up in these plans, where these larger strategic questions are also kept secret. We don't know what government powers the government would try to exercise in the event of a catastrophic emergency. We know from declassified materials now that during the Cold War, they contemplated amazingly sweeping plans that through the Cold War, that, we're familiar with the presidential football, the nuclear briefcase that follows the president around. Well, most people don't know that there was also an attorney general's emergency football that followed the attorney general around during the Cold War.
Let's call it a lacrosse ball. I think it should be a lacrosse ball.
Yep. Yeah. And that you had, in this briefcase, these draft executive orders, legislation suspending habeas corpus, declaring martial law, suspending civil liberties, that there were actually lists of thousands of suspected subversives who would be arrested after the signing of what was known then as the master arrest warrant. And that these were people who, J. Edgar Hoover thought, hadn't committed a crime, but he just suspected that they were probably trouble. And so in the first hours of the activation of these emergency powers, you would have these, all of these people arrested. We know from declassified plans that Dwight Eisenhower actually deputized private sector business leaders with emergency dictatorial czar powers, and would have allowed these people to, there would have been someone who would have stepped in and been in charge of all U.S. manufacturing. Someone who would have seized all of the nation's transportation system and nationalized it. We know that there would have been someone who would have been in charge of, setting all of the wages and prices in the United States.
What I love about that is that essentially, in order to stop communism, they were planning to turn us into Stalinist Russia in the event of an emergency.
And that we don't know, whether these same plans exist in some sort of modern analog. We assume that there's that same draft legislation kicking around, declaring martial law, suspending habeas corpus. I mean, that's a pretty basic thing to still exist today. But, does Mark Zuckerberg have a secret letter in his top desk drawer that he would be, deputized to run something? Does, Jeff Immelt at GE, is he the secret wartime czar of manufacturing and we just don't know?
Yeah, that was the interesting about this book, too. And you talk about this at the beginning with your research, is that there's a lot of classified information that you couldn't get to, but it wasn't modern classified. It was stuff going back to JFK, right? That was still classified that you could not get access to.
Oh yeah, and still classified Truman and Eisenhower plans too. I mean, this is, and it really makes you worry, as I said in the book, about what could the communications plans be from the era of the rotary telephone that are still relevant to our modern emergency plans?
Well, one thing that I felt like is still relevant is the way that emergency planners sometimes really overlook essential factors of human nature. So this is also a theme in your book that people are, and the story that was really compelling to me was this feud between the wives and the secretaries, where the
Yes.
Eisenhower wives realized that although they were not going to be saved during nuclear wars, the secretaries of all of their powerful husbands would be saved and would presumably be the ones repopulating the earth. Is that right?
And that was a problem identified in the literal first emergency evacuation plan, Operation Alert 1954. And I can tell you that it was a plan right through, or a problem right through the Cold War. Earl Warren was, when he was Chief Justice of the United States, he was given his emergency evacuation pass, looked at it, asked where the one was for his wife, and was told there wasn't one for his wife. And so he handed back his pass and said, well, I'm not evacuating if my wife doesn't.
That's right. Feminist.
Fascinating.
And then, even during the Obama years, I was talking to someone who was part of these plans, just within the last couple of years. And there was a designated helicopter that would drop out of the sky in Washington and find him wherever he was and whisk him off to one of these bunkers. Well, he has 2 young daughters. And he told me, if anyone thinks that I'm going to, if that helicopter lands on my daughter's soccer field, that I'm going to wave goodbye to them and then take off in the helicopter like they're crazy. And of course, like, you have to think both about what would happen in a real war, but then also what happens in a false alarm where that helicopter lands, everyone takes off, leaves their spouses and families behind, and then they're like, oh, just kidding, that was a false alarm. Like, we're going to drop you back on that soccer field now, and you can be glared at by all of the parents.
So, one thing we want to talk about is the buy-in to the evacuation drills that we saw here. I mean, one thing, as emergency managers, we are always trying to get the mayor, the governor, the president, some executive in the room for these drills. And it seems like these guys were doing crazy levels of drills. The city of Portland actually evacuated. Chicago was going to brand their children with some kind of... Were they really going to brand their children?
JFK participated in actual evacuation drills where they would physically relocate him to underground bunkers. It's just the level of buy-in all the way up to the highest is amazing.
So yeah, I mean this was a huge thing in the 1950s and 1960s. I mean, listeners of a certain era, remember those duck and cover drills and Bert the Turtle from the 1950s. And it's wacky now to sort of look back on this and think of entire cities running evacuation drills. But part of what I found so interesting and poignant about recreating this history was coming to understand the extent to which planning for doomsday affected real world decision making by the presidents, that it was really in these exercises. I mean, so during the Cold War, as you say, Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, Carter, Reagan, they went through very extensive drills. I mean, in the, Nixon and Carter and Reagan, they, went up in the presidential doomsday plane, the airborne command post that would have been where presidents could run nuclear war from the sky. And it's these converted 747s known as the Night Watch planes, the E-4B airborne national command posts. And these, they actually drilled aboard these planes. And in many ways, I think actually it was that experience of like watching a nuclear war unfold that led presidents to really wrestle with just how bad nuclear war would be, and actually at key moments then take a step back from the precipice because they had actually had to wrestle with the outcomes of doomsday.
So I think that sobering fact, there's an emergency theorist called Lee Clark who calls plans like this fantasy documents, because they're really actually designed to sort of provide comfort to the people that are writing them and working on them. And in that vein, one of the things that fascinated us about these nuclear plans was this nuclear football itself, which I still picture as a football, but apparently there's not a handcuff. There's a leather jerkin that attaches to the handler's wrist. But what was in it sort of changed over time as the plans changed. So can you talk about that sort of planning process and how what the president actually has in the football shifted?
Yeah, so this is so the presidential football dates at least back to Kennedy. The popular mythology is that it came into being after the Cuban Missile Crisis, but there was a version of it that actually dated back to the Eisenhower years. And it got its name because the war plan at the time was codenamed Dropkick. Dropkick, a football reference, which is how that became the football, which became the black briefcase that followed the president around all the time. And it is contrary to popular mythology. I mean, there is no like big red button. There is no, biometric scanner that authenticates the president. And he basically has the briefcase is a bunch of binders of different options. One military aide called it basically the Denny's menu of nuclear war. And you sort of look at it and you say, like, I'll take a little of column A, a little bit of column B, and then maybe a side order of China. And then, that's the nuclear war that you would order.
Did it have to be a Denny's menu? Could it not be, a little more sophistication?
Like a Waffle House menu?
If we're going to die, at least let us die via Waffle House.
Yeah.
Well, so I think part of it was, like you have photos and, graphics involved in it. And that was how the Denny's menu reference came in. That it wasn't just a literary document, but that, it was an illustrated document.
So is that what Carter, because you give Carter a lot of props in this book, and Carter, as a fellow Georgian, I just want to say I love Jimmy Carter, who's building houses right now, and what are you doing sitting on your ass, Andrew McMahon?
Right. I'm not building a house.
What did Carter do to the football to sort of make it more relevant for his needs?
So Carter came into office and it actually, and this was a surprise to me, became very deeply involved in this emergency planning. I mean, he really more than almost any president of the Cold War, dealt with this. And his staff ran repeated drills. And part of that was they actually went through the football and discovered that it was actually not in great shape at that point, that it had sort of accumulated a lot of documents that were not relevant or were outdated. I found one memo that actually discussed that parts of the nuclear football at that time were actually illegal. And so they spent a lot of effort trying to update it and then pare it down, sort of makes nuclear war as simple as they could, because they understood just how little time they would have to deal with it. And part of what I thought was particularly poignant about that and Carter's preparations was he became very interested in who he would be talking to during a nuclear war. And so he would hold familiarization telephone calls with the people who would likely be on the other end of his nuclear war orders. Just so that they knew what each other's voices were like. And so that they could sort of have a little bit more of a comfort level with each other if it actually came to nuclear war.
So if I'm understanding this right, the football that the military officer carries behind the president is not, I always thought of it as an electronic device that with a big red button that they push and launch it, but it's rather contingency plans of options that then the president makes, and then that decision gets carried out by various branches of the military to launch the weapons.
Yes. So he would call someone at the Pentagon or at Raven Rock, which is the title of the book, the alternate Pentagon, the hollowed out mountain in Waynesboro, Pennsylvania, that serves as the alternate fallback emergency Pentagon. And it would, it would be through those channels that nuclear war actually got launched.
So, and this brings us to, and first off, the nuclear football is the vindication for every emergency planner ever, because how important are the documents that the one pager in the nuclear football, that is the ultimate emergency one pager, but it doesn't mean anything without an existing workable command, control, and communication apparatus. And that's what sort of Raven Rock was supposed to be. And it only ended up seeming like a sci-fi moon base, although apparently it's still operational. So how was Raven Rock meant to sort of complete this command and control circle?
So the goal was that, again, as we talked about, there always being someone in charge of, in the role of the presidency. The goal was also to always ensure that there were redundant communication systems. And this was where I probably came away most wowed by the bizarreness of the various schemes that came up with during the Cold War to make these communication systems redundant. So you had, not just all of the normal radio systems, but we built a special set of ICBMs at Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri that held basically telephone answering machines in their nose cones that launch officers could record an emergency launch message and then launch those ICBMs that would then broadcast those messages as they flew around the world and help to reach the satellite or reach the submarines.
I'm sorry. Talk about breaking up with somebody via voicemail.
That's right.
Crazy.
And then, we had flights of these planes. The Navy had this fleet of TACAMO planes that were worldwide global command post communications planes, where the goal was that these planes were always flying over the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans, and that you could basically speak all the way around the world from one plane to the next in this line and ensure that you could get messages to the submarines. And then if that wasn't enough, there was these plans to build the world's largest radio station in the northern Wisconsin and Michigan that was known as Project ELF, that was extremely low frequency radio systems that would have encompassed something like 20% of the entire land mass of Michigan, to turn it into the world's largest and final radio station, to ensure that even if absolutely everything else failed, you could still reach the submarines and tell them to launch.
And then the internet came along and disrupted all of their their secret plans.
Mitch and I are both emergency managers. We've worked in emergency management pretty much our whole careers, and I'd always heard that FEMA was born out of the civil defense and kind of the Cold War era. But I'm wondering if for our listeners you could kind of talk about that transition from civil defense to what we know of FEMA today, how that happened, why that happened.
Yeah, so this is oversimplifying a relatively complex and long-running story
that
about government bureaucracy. FEMA sort of became the agency that responds to natural disasters because it turned out there weren't that many nuclear wars to respond to. And so it had built up this capability. I mean, it started out effectively just as a agency in charge of emergency planning for wartime, and had a deeply classified budget. At its start, it was spending for every $1 that it spent preparing for natural disasters, it was spending $12 in a classified unknown budget preparing for nuclear war. And that this was a effort, through multiple administrations to basically build this entire secret apparatus. FEMA was the agency that was running these bunkers. That FEMA actually still runs these bunkers today, and that it only really began to take over the public role of responding to natural disasters because it already had this capability and these stockpiles and these resources and this personnel, because they were training to prepare for nuclear war.
Oh my God. I think Fugate was holding out on this. I think that, so you're saying still today, all this stuff about Michael Brown and we talked to Craig Fugate and all of this, you're saying that there is still a classified budget attached to FEMA that nobody talks about?
A large classified budget attached to FEMA. FEMA is still the agency that is in charge of running Mount Weather, which is the second major bunker outside of Washington. And it is it's where the president would go, the cabinet secretaries would go. Today it's where the Supreme Court would go. It's where the members of Congress, the congressional leadership who were evacuated on 9/11 went. And they are, this is all a FEMA apparatus that is still sort of exists mostly out of sight on, sealed off classified floors of its headquarters here in Washington.
Sorry, my mind's a little blown by that.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting.
I mean, it does, because I'm just going to say it raises this question of whether everything we do as emergency managers has a secret other purpose that we don't know about. But I'm not going to go there. I'm not going to fall into despair.
By emergency planning.
Let's talk about something else you mentioned, which is 9/11. So I guess the question I want to frame this with is why, it seems to me reading your book was really revelatory, and that it seems like we as a country spent trillions of dollars on many things that many people just thought were crazy. I mean, just crazy pants. You have so many quotes of generals being like, well, that's never going to work. And like people being like, well, that's crazy. And then on 9/11, in some ways we pulled the trigger for all of it. and it really didn't work so well. So I guess can you walk us through this sort of giant, tragedy, but also in some way a dress rehearsal for a larger tragedy that 9/11 was?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. These plans, 9/11 was really the only time in our history that we have activated these plans in an actual emergency. We have come close in multiple instances. We've come close in situations like the Cuban Missile Crisis. But 9/11 was, the only time that you have had these evacuation helicopters swoop in to the west lawn of the Capitol and sweep the congressional leadership away to Mount Weather. And what you had sort of play out throughout that day was all of the scenarios that emergency planners for 50 years had been predicting were going to happen in exactly that type of situation, where, as one example, there has always been a trade-off between whether a leader was secure or whether they were in control. And that it's a real struggle in emergency planning to keep someone secure but in communication. And so on 9/11, we were successfully able to get President Bush into Air Force One and up into the sky after he'd been reading at the elementary school in Sarasota, Florida. But that came at a cost of him being out of touch for many of the key hours of 9/11, and particularly not visible to the public. And he received tremendous criticism, as you no doubt remember, that he didn't pull the Rudy Giuliani, that he didn't march right down to ground zero and stand on the rubble.
No, I was personally ticked at him, actually.
Yeah, he made the right decision in his role as commander-in-chief of the United States, but that's not necessarily what we expect our head of state to do.
Sure.
And then, at the Pentagon, you had Donald Rumsfeld, Secretary of Defense, who, at the moment the Pentagon was attacked, he was, he responded in an incredibly leaderly way and went to the crash site and literally helped carry the wounded out of the attack on stretchers. Well, that was exactly the wrong thing for him to do as the Secretary of Defense. Right. The plans called for, and he should have, been immediately evacuated by helicopter to Raven Rock. Yeah. And what ended up happening was, instead, a couple of hours later, he sent his deputy, Paul Wolfowitz, off to Raven Rock.
And how much choice do these executives have in a situation like that? I've heard Dick Cheney talk about he was basically just grabbed by Secret Service agents and marched out into a bunker and out. Do they have a say in what happens to them?
Well, so this was sort of part of what was so interesting on 9/11 was President Bush, actually aboard Air Force One, was desperate to return to Washington. And he understood he needed to be back at the White House. He understood people needed to see him, to talk with him, or see him and hear him talk to them. And it was the military and the Secret Service that said, effectively, no, we're not taking you to Washington. We're going to put you down at these Air Force bases until we're sure that you're safe. And that this is, in many ways, I talked to the pilot of Air Force One. I talked to the lead Secret Service agent on board that day. And they both said, we're not really sure what would have happened if the president had given us a direct order. But we're not entirely sure that we would have listened to him.
Oh, that's scary to me. That's probably the scariest thing in the book to me.
Yeah,
and maybe it's the right thing. I don't know, but
well, there are so many. The whole book is this tension between what is planned and what people actually do, right? And there are so many times in the book, New York City stopping the election is one you talk about. But all of these times when emergencies happen and leaders make choices that aren't in the plan, and they might or might not have the authority or ability to do that, but they do it anyway, right? They just they start improvising, and then either people go along with it or they don't. It is terrifying, right? Geez, here's what I want to point out. My personal favorite use of an emergency plan ever was in this book, which is in the Washington, D.C. area when they started locking it down and everybody was like, oh my God, we've got to evacuate the city. How do we do it? There's a national park ranger in your book who pulls his 10-year-old emergency civil defense evacuation plan out of his pocket. He spreads it out and he's like, all right, y'all, I got the plan. Let's do it. And they rolled it, right? That's like the dream. Yeah. That's the emergency manager dream right there.
It was the plan for how to secure the White House during the Gulf War. Oh. So, I mean, that was... as you said, almost a decade earlier, but he was still, for some reason, carrying it around in his briefcase.
See, that just warms my heart. Right
so we're getting close to the end of our time here, but just kind of getting close to wrapping up. Did it work? Was it useful? Was all this continuity of government mechanism coup? Did it work? So
I think that the answer is, it worked well enough. You need it, and you guys understand this from the emergency management and planning perspective. You really need to have some type of plan. Yes. It may not work perfectly, but you can't start thinking this through in the moment. And so, none of this would have worked anywhere close to the way that it existed in the black and white plan of the, as it was written down during the Cold War. It still wouldn't work today in the way that it's written down in the modern analog of these plans. But it's a good foundation, and it was a necessary exercise. I think that part of what I found so interesting about this over the course of it was understanding how quickly these questions about how do you preserve America and the American government becomes this very existential question of what is America? Are you trying to preserve the presidency? Are you trying to preserve the three branches of government? Are you trying to preserve the historical totems that have bound us together generation by generation as Americans? Sort of part of these plans were the extent to which there were at the National Archives plans to, they ranked their documents and decided that they would save the Declaration of Independence before they would save the Constitution. That at the Library of Congress, they figured out that they would save Lincoln's Gettysburg Address before they saved George Washington's military commission. The National Gallery of Art sat down and figured out, what paintings they would save in what order. And even in Philadelphia, there was a specially trained team of park rangers whose job it was to evacuate the Liberty Bell in the event of a Soviet attack on the United States.
Wow, that would be a great Nicolas Cage movie.
Well, I just sort of have this picture of these park rangers, driving off into the mountains of Appalachia with this Liberty Bell swinging in the back of their pickup truck.
Right.
And then them getting there and being like, no, I swear the crack was there before we started.
Yeah, were there two cracks? I don't remember.
What's amazing about this to me, and this is a little off topic, I guess, but reading this, it is such an American story, both about the idea of America, but also because it has so many sort of surprising uses for parts of America. As a person from the Southeast, we used to visit the Biltmore Estates, which is in North Carolina. It's a famous tourist attraction, which was also, it turns out, the evacuation location for the National Gallery of Art that you mentioned, or the Grove Park Inn in Asheville, North Carolina, or the Greenbrier Hotel complex. There are all of these places around the United States that had these incredible secret uses that you talk about.
Yeah, and and there were those, and one of the weirder things that I came across, at least for me, was coming to understand. So there was this area in Nevada, north of Las Vegas, that known as the Nevada Test Site, still exists today, which is where we, for much of the 1950s, did our domestic nuclear testing.
Yeah.
And, we would actually build, cities and houses and forests out in the Nevada desert and then blow them up with nuclear bombs. And that before Las Vegas became, known for its gambling, people would go for the bomb parties. And you would go to Las Vegas and you would stand on the roofs of your hotels, and in the early morning you'd watch the nuclear bombs go off in the desert to the north, and watch the mushroom clouds and the flash, and
it's
just
its
sort
own
of
form
like
of gambling, really.
Just this entirely other world, sort of lost to American history now.
Yeah, that's crazy. It reminds me of the story my dad told of growing up, and the asbestos trucks would come through town and create this fog, and the kids would all run out behind the truck and knock into each other because they couldn't see because of the clouds, because they didn't know it was dangerous.
That's not a fun story. That's a sad story.
So, Garrett, are you more of a conspiracy theorist after writing this book? Do you have more confidence in government? Where are you on the conspiracy theorist range?
Well, so I've covered national security for a long time.
Yeah.
And my general dubiousness of conspiracy theories is that most conspiracy theories presuppose a level of competence in government that is not illustrated in other areas of government.
Yes.
And so, what I do think is true is, and particularly after doing this book, that there are kernels of truth in many of these conspiracy theories. And that a lot of the conspiracy theories are sort of unwinding them to understand what is the truth at the center of it. So, in many ways, actually, as I said at the beginning, like the truth of these stories, of these doomsday plans during the Cold War, is that they're actually much weirder and wackier than the conspiracy theories about them.
Right.
And there's this whole idea, there's this whole post-doomsday, post-apocalypse analog of the U.S. government that comes out in these plans, where the post office was the agency that was in charge of registering the dead and figuring out who was still alive. The Park Service was the agency that would actually run the refugee camps. The Department of Agriculture was in charge of the rations and figuring out who would be fed what. And sort of all of these ideas of what American government would look like after the Cold War are in many ways more fantastical in real life than anything that we could imagine for our modern world.
We're about to hit you with our lightning round, Garrett, so just take a minute to mentally prepare. But it really is, there's so much that we did not cover in this. We didn't talk about the nuclear testing so much. We didn't talk about the New York City evacuation.
Right, there's
planning,
a plan
which is
to
amazing.
evacuate all of New York City, which is two New Yorkers we were pretty jazzed about.
We didn't talk about Eleanor Roosevelt. I mean, there's so many things.
Yeah.
Oh.
If you haven't read this book, please read this book.
Yeah. Yeah, the New York City evacuation plans are some of my favorites, of the idea that it would take precisely 3.3 days, precisely such and such numbers of the Staten Island ferry, going from one place to another. And, from the emergency planner perspective, you can just sort of imagine how that conversation goes, of being like, no, you guys are totally fine. You're going to be evacuated on day 3. So just go home, stay calm. We're going to take your neighbors today. We're going to take your family tomorrow, but we'll come back for you on day 3.
Right.
Oh
Hey, New Yorker, wait patiently, and please don't tweet, and we'll get to you in 3 days.
We're so exactly like that.
Okay, so Garrett, are you ready for our lightning round of questions?
I am.
Okay, there's no wrong answer. Answer off the top
There
of your
are
head.
actually some wrong answers.
First question, Garrett. What's your favorite hazard?
Well, I guess I'd probably have to go biological.
That's a good one.
So this is a slightly different question. What's the hazard that scares you the most? What keeps you up at night?
The loss of the electrical grid.
Ted Koppel guy. Ted Koppel guy. Yeah, that's terrifying.
That is a good one. So what is the first disaster that you remember?
The Challenger, actually, the explosion of the Challenger.
That's interesting. I think that's mine too. Yeah.
I might cry right now. What's but okay, so a little different question for you. So it might be we usually ask, what's the first major disaster that you worked? For you, it might be the one that you wrote about.
9/11.
And is that what we didn't ask this at the beginning, but I'm curious, what turned you on to continuity of government as a topic to write a book about?
Oh my God, this is a lightning round.
I know. I'm sorry. I just had to work that out because I'm really
good.
curious
Yep,
about
good.
it.
So I'd run up against these plans a bunch of times covering other stories, talking to people who had been evacuated on 9/11, people who had been part of these plans during the Obama or Bush years. But the true story, and this is like as an emergency management person, like your nightmare, the genesis of this book was a colleague of mine at the magazine who found an intelligence officer's badge on the floor of a subway parking garage.
No.
And brought it into me and was like, oh, like, you cover this stuff. Like, you can figure out how to get it back to this guy. And when I turned the badge over, it had evacuation instructions on it.
Oh, my God.
And so I started following them on Google Maps, Google Satellite. And it ended at this mountain in West Virginia. And I could see on the satellite that this road went up this mountain. There was a guard shack, a chain link fence, and then like 50 yards more of the road. And then it just disappeared into the side of the mountain. And I was like, wow, like, this is a facility I've never heard of. It's not marked on the map. Like, I've got to figure out what this is. And I've got to, like, figure out how this fits into the continuity of government plans. And that led me to go back and really sort of figure out how to, sort of where these plans began and how they unfolded.
Are you kidding me?
That is
I
so
can't
much
believe
better.
we almost did not get that story. That is amazing.
It's a lot better than my Thomasville story. That is how the movie. That's the movie. That's how the movie opens.
Yeah,
right there.
the movie of your life, Garrett. That's how. So did you eventually give the badge back to the poor soul who lost his?
Yes. We got the badge back to him same day.
Okay.
All right.
Oh
I'm
my
asking
gosh.
the next question. I'm moving this along.
All right.
So, what, Garrett, is your dream cog job?
And you can go back in time for this. It can be a job from the 30s.
That's a great question. So I actually think that being part of that team that planned those first operation alerts. I mean, the photos from it, they literally are just so campy. I mean, it's Eisenhower and his team meeting in a big tent, these big cardboard signs that say things like Council of Economic Advisors in this direction, the cabinet agencies in the other direction. And they're all just sitting on these camp chairs. Alan Dulles is there smoking a big pipe, sitting in the midst of the group. That just would have been a really fascinating time.
Yeah, that would have been great. So you kind of talked about best or your dream. So maybe what would be the worst position?
Well, I don't know whether it's the worst position, but certainly the oddest is the NORAD bunker in Cheyenne Mountain in Colorado Springs, sort of the third of these major mountain-sized bunkers. It actually has a Subway fast food franchise inside the mountain.
Gotta eat fresh.
And so, if you are the Subway employee working the shift when nuclear war happens, you will be the only fast food worker in the United States to survive nuclear war.
That is
Time
amazing.
to ask for a raise. Yeah.
Favorite disaster movie?
War Games.
Because we didn't even talk about how computers almost destroyed the Earth several times.
That was the topic we had on our outline, is that talked about how computers several times have almost led to global annihilation, but we'll save that.
Yeah, we can. Best COG acronym. What's your favorite?
I actually really like NECAP, the National Emergency Airborne Command Post, those presidential doomsday planes.
That means I'm going to just defy the lightning round format again. Okay. This book had my favorite acronym sentence of all time in it. It out-acronymed every other acronym sentence. I'm going to read it now. Under the MAD theory, if, for instance, BMUs and NORAD confirmed a USSR boob attacked on CONUS, the NCA, either POTUS, SecDef, or the AEO aboard the Abednik would see a Pinnacle OPREP 3 nuke flash alert and then turn to the Overlook, FEMA's or the NEAC to issue EMs activating SIAP, move the nation to DEFCON 1, mobilize COG and COOP to notify DOD and ZACTO, ICBMs, ALCMs, and SLBMs, raining MIRVs down upon USSR DGZs pre-selected by INSTAP and just.
What did your editor say, Garrett, when you wrote that sentence? Did you get a flag on that one, or?
Well, so what I can promise your listeners is that if you read this book, that sentence will make absolute total sense to you by the end of the book.
It's true. That is definitely true. Okay, last question is, what's your favorite Cold War piece of gear?
Ooh, so my favorite Cold War piece of gear, it's a very large piece of gear, were the presidential floating White Houses, the National Emergency Command Posts afloat, the NECPAs, which were these two special Navy command ships, the USS Wright, the USS Northampton, one of them a converted aircraft carrier, one of them a converted cruiser, that held that sort of stood station off the Atlantic coast waiting to receive the president in the event of a nuclear attack. And my sort of favorite factoid from that is that Bob Woodward, the investigative reporter, when he did his Navy service, was one of the nuclear emergency action officers aboard the NECPAs. So if President Johnson had ever started nuclear war or been involved in nuclear war, it would have been Bob Woodward who would have greeted him at the floating White House to tell him how to run nuclear war.
Oh my gosh! I mean, well, I guess there's worse people that could fill that role. That's great.
That's right. Could have been Bernstein.
Well, Garrett, thank you so much for writing this book. You've documented a key piece of U.S. history that not many people know about, and thank you for your attention to detail and your thoroughness. It's just a fascinating read, and you're able to make these what could be a very dry, boring subject really come alive. So thank you.
For people that really think about the end of the world probably as much as we do, this probably is perfect summer beach reading for you.
It's great.
It's crazy to say, but that is exactly how I thought of this book. I read it. I actually read it twice. I have it on all of my devices. There are 3 copies in front of us right now. Thank you so much, Garrett, for being on the show.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks so much for having me. It's been really fun.
And we will see you in a bunker someday soon.
That sounds great. Thanks so much, guys.
Thanks, Garrett.
My mind is blown.
Yeah, this is one of those episodes I wish we had a video on us, because Mitch and I had our mouth wide open the whole time. We're like, what? What? Especially that end story about him finding the ID. I mean, that's straight out of the movie.
He's sitting there in the rain, in the darkness, staring up at the mountain.
It leads down a road that's not on any maps.
The Raven Rock, all of these places have a blast door followed by a mile of curved tunnel to another blast door before the compound even starts. That's right. The scale we're talking about.
Because if the blast comes, affects the building, it won't be able to go around the curve.
I did want to do a little bit of a best practice roll up, because there are so many mistakes in this book. Honestly, if you're in an emergency, you read through it. There's so many there's crazy crap that people keep doing. There were a couple of lessons that I felt were really important and very clear at the end. So one is that, and some of these we didn't even talk about, but if you devolve to a known location, that is, if you evacuate to a place that's already an office of your business, which is in another city, much better idea than building a big bunker for trillions of dollars underneath the mountain. Seems to work out much better. Second one is always take families into account. Make sure people's families and children are taken care of.
And honestly, that's that's still stuff we struggle with today.
Yeah, we
right?
still don't do it.
Yeah.
I'm still planning to abandon my family in any disaster that comes up.
Right.
But
partly because it's such a hard thing to answer.
yeah.
You know?
Well, you could just put childcare, in a basement or something. We can't actually solve that problem probably on the show.
Sounds
so
very scary.
The third thing is tactical planning, like really specific geeky planning about which ferry is going to take people where and which helicopter goes is basically useless. Like it never seems to do any good in any of these things. Lock your big strategies and then let people let Donald Rumsfeld be Donald Rumsfelds in the moment.
Right. Trust people to, in the moment, be equipped to make the right decision,
Right.
which with some guidance.
That's right. They're going to use your judgment. Whether you like it or not, you might as well empower them to make good choices. And the last one is that more than really long specific plans, mechanisms people can use, things like, and we didn't really talk about these, like GETS, the Government Emergency Telecommunication Service, or WPS, the Wireless Priority Service, these things that are systems people can tap into in emergencies, those seemed really useful. They seemed like things that actually helped people in an emergency. So we're focused on building those things up.
Yes. All right. Well, if you haven't read the book, if you haven't heard of it, pick it up. It's a great read. It's fascinating if you're in emergency management to see kind of how the emergency management disaster preparedness world came into being, to read about mistakes of the past and how we learn from them. It's great. So,
give us a call if you got questions. We've gotten a couple calls about emergency management education in the past few weeks, so we'll try and tag back to that. Our phone number is 859-429-2731. Ask us anything you like. Ask us relationship advice. Ask us for Game of Thrones spoilers. It turns out we know how it's going to end.
It started again, yeah. So we, we'll set up our Game of Thrones podcast. You can follow us on Twitter, Hazards Podcast. And
if you like us, rate us on iTunes, rate us on Pod. Seriously,
nobody ever rates us.
We do this for the love. We need the love. Well, we don't actually need the love. We do actually. We need the love. We need the love. Andrew needs the love.
All right. Thanks for listening. See you next time.
Goodbye. I need the love.
Should be not what's in your go bag, but what's in your football. We should change it.
It's what's in your.
What do you carry? What does your handler carry in your football?
I need a handler.